2LO calling. 2LO calling. This is the London station of the British Broadcasting Company. Thank you for standing by.
This bulletin marks the moment 100 years ago that the BBC began broadcasting. Tonight we'll hear about the radio pioneers and the key moments that made history. Still to come?
I was so nervous. I remember thinking, I'm going to be sick.
Memories of reading Britain's longest-running news bulletin. It's 100 years to the day that the BBC took to the airwaves. Today, the corporation is one of the most recognisable brands in the world, informing, educating and entertaining millions. But it all began in a small room on the 7th floor of Marconi House on the Strand in the West End of London in 1922. In those days, the BBC had 4 employees. The forerunner of this bulletin was the first programme ever broadcast. Our media correspondent, David Silito, has gone back in time to meet the pioneers who shaped the world of broadcasting.
Hello. 2LO calling. 2LO calling.
2LO, the call sign for the BBC in London, and also
thank you for standing by.
The voice of Mr. Arthur Burrows, the BBC's first director of programmes. He was also the man who read the news, and on Children's Hour, he was Uncle Arthur. And also wrote this important memo.
A.R. Burrows to L. Stanton Jeffries.
Read out by the BBC's first director of music, Mr. Stanton Jeffries.
The British Broadcasting Committee has arranged to transmit the following programmes each evening.
Who was also Uncle Jeff.
6 p.m. news bulletin, 8 to 9 music, 9 to 9:30 news, 9:30 to 10 music.
The first news bulletin came from the Reuters news agency. The stories, a report from the Old Bailey, a speech by the Prime Minister, Andrew Bonar-Law, a train robbery, the sale of a Shakespeare First Folio, the fog in London, and some sport, the latest billiard scores. However, there was more than one BBC. New research shows that 2ZY in Manchester, which was already on air,
This is 2ZY calling. The Manchester
appears to have broadcast the first children's programme. And on day 2,
5IT Birmingham call.
5IT in Birmingham joined in and was broadcasting election results.
Birmingham Ladywood Division. Mr. Neville Chamberlain, Unionist.
However, officially the BBC began at 6 p.m. with the news from London. And while the audience wasn't large, these pioneers of broadcasting knew they were making history. And while there's no recording of this opening night, Mr. Burrows took it very seriously, writing that he could think of no more exacting test of physical fitness and nervous condition than the reading of a news bulletin to the British Isles.
Our home editor, Mark Easton, looks back at a century of BBC headlines.
Time for the BBC News. Since the first radio bulletins in 1922, chime bars or the reassuring pips or the steady bongs of Big Ben have announced the day's headlines. The key events from a century of British and world history from the trusted BBC newsroom.
This country is at war with Germany.
It was BBC Radio which informed a nation at war. And with the peace, the arrival of news on the television service in 1948.
The King, who retired to rest last night in his usual health.
News of the death of George VI.
Passed peacefully away in his sleep.
And then the coronation of Elizabeth II.
Arrayed in her utmost splendour, wearing the imperial crown.
An event which changed the relationship between the people and the national broadcaster forever.
To the cheers of her subjects and the joyful sound of the bells of Westminster Abbey.
This should be a moment in television history, because this programme will bring together more faces throughout the world than has ever been possible before.
The broadcasting advances of the 1960s brought momentous events into homes as they unfolded.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The BBC tailoring news for different audiences. On the World Service and on Newsround, a news service for children.
Hello again, and there's great news tonight from Mount Everest. And
Did you threaten to overrule him?
The truth of the matter is that
BBC News was more than a digest of what had happened. It saw part of its role as holding the powerful to account.
I did not overrule Derek
Did you
Lewis.
threaten to overrule
Mr. Marriott
The 90s saw the birth of rolling news on a dedicated BBC News TV channel and on a new radio station, Radio 5.
Asma, thank you. It's 1 o'clock. Good afternoon. Welcome back to Westminster. This is Simon Mayo here on 5 Live.
The BBC website was born, the first step in providing an online news service, a move which saw the licence-funded corporation in direct competition with newspaper websites.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction.
At times of crisis, the BBC has remained the most trusted news source, and the pandemic saw large audiences tuning to the corporation's news bulletins.
You must stay at home.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
The coverage of Her Majesty the Queen's death was another reminder of the important place in Britain's national life that BBC News continues to have. It has made mistakes in its 100 years, but the values and principles that underpin BBC News mean it remains a powerful gravitational force in the media galaxy, shaping the tone of the national conversation and remaining a focal point for people's understanding of the world.
We couldn't end our programme tonight without hearing from some of the broadcasters who became household names reading this bulletin over the years. Our correspondent, Rebecca Jones, has been speaking to 3 of them.
They're the voices that have kept us company over decades. Here's Brian Perkins reading the BBC News back in the 1960s.
There's been a demonstration in Prague tonight against the Moscow Agreement allowing Soviet troops to remain in Czechoslovakia until, in the words of the official communiqué, the situation becomes normal.
He may have made it sound effortless, but don't be deceived.
I wouldn't say that reading the news is like a stage performance, but it is in its own way a kind of performance.
Corrie Caulfield remembers her first bulletin in the 1980s.
I was so nervous. I remember thinking, I'm going to be sick. So I took a waste paper bin and put it under the desk by the chair, just in case, during the bongs of Big Ben, it was all going to get too much.
Neil Sleep thinks his voice rose 7 octaves when he started out in the 1990s.
I've many times been listening in the kitchen, usually chopping onions, and something about the chimes makes you swivel your head towards the radio. And the first time I was in the studio to read the 6 o'clock news, I've had this very strong image of somebody chopping onions on the other side of the loudspeaker, and I was on the wrong side of the loudspeaker, and it was pretty scary.
And then there's the challenge of reading difficult news day in, day out.
There are so many news stories which involve human aggression and violence that sometimes it's quite difficult to identify what is significant and what is not, because there are so many awful things happening on a daily basis.
I'm going to butt in here. I think also it's important to remember sometimes you have very good news stories. I remember being on the night that Brian Keenan, who was one of the Beirut hostages, was released. It was just wonderful to be able to start off the bulletin with a good news story.
And while they may have retired from reading the news, the bulletin remains part of their lives.
Since I left, I do listen to the 6 o'clock news on Radio 4 very regularly. I'm back chopping onions on the right side of the loudspeaker again.
In a sort of world of noise, if you like, where everything has to be instant and breaking and ping, ping, ping on your phone, I think to have a measured 30 minutes of quality journalism is second to none, and long may it continue.
BBC News.
Read tonight by Caroline Nichols.